This motor is off a Electrolux vacuum cleaner, and it looks like the bearings have seized up. Now a lot of these you can open and repair as long as the armature is still fine. Now this is a Chinese machine. The whole casing is sheet metal, so you can't clamp it in a vise or anything, it will distort. How I open it, I take a screwdriver and I put it against the outer flange, and you just tap it, and then you get to your blade. Now the blade has got a nut that holds it on, but when you put a nut on, it's very difficult to hold the blade and there's nothing to grip on. So what I do is I put my spanner on and I'll take a hammer and I'll just tap it, and what happens is it loosens the blade. You can undo the nut, and this is your suction blade with a washer. There's a little spacer there, this diffuser comes off, and there's 4 little screws that holds this plate on. The Allen keys. I'm just going to get the Allen key to loosen it. You just break each one, and then they should unscrew. Okay, now that I've got the screws off, it's still held on with friction. But now with this, if you put a screwdriver in here and trying to wedge it out, there's a chance you might bend the metal, and then you'll never get this to line up again. So what I do is I just put the nut back on, and I'll just give it a tap with a hammer. And that's got a tendency to loose it. You see now everything is loose. And often you can just pull it out. It's still a bit tight. Give it a second tap. Okay. There it comes out. This is the bearing that failed. It just fell apart here. And then there's a second bearing up here that still feels alright. But once you got the motor open like this, I'd like to replace both. And what I do is I just put a little bearing puller on here, pull it off. We stick 2 new bearings in and put it together. This is the little bearing puller I normally use, but because this bearing is broken and there's only half of it left, it's going to be difficult to get the bearing puller in there to pull it off, and this puller will not work. So what I do when we get to this point where we can't get a bearing puller in is I just take a disc grinder and I grind a slot on each side of this broken bearing, and then the 2 bits should fall off. In order to do that, you have to clamp it in a vise, but just be very careful. If you push on this rotor, you can damage it. So what I normally do is I put a cloth around it, and then you clamp it on the cloth, and then that is quite steady, and I'll just cut that with a disc. It's going to make a big noise. Okay, now while we're cutting, we must be very careful not to cut any of the armature bit, but we want to cut the bearing. What we've done now is we've cut a groove in this bearing, and sometimes if we just force it now, it should come off. Give it a try. No, it's still stuck, so it's going to cut that groove a little bit deeper. Got the little bearing off now. I've cut it almost through. There's the shaft. I made a little mark on it, but it shouldn't be a problem. And hopefully this one will be easier. This one we can pull off with a puller. Okay. This is the bearing from the top. It came out quite easily. Here's the other half of the broken one. What I like to do with the armature before I put the new bearings on, I'll put it in a drill and spin it, and put a little piece of sandpaper on this commutator where the carbon brushes run. And you just get it a nice smooth. Now these connections are nice and shiny, and we can take it out of the drill. This is our armature, and the two bearings are just a press fit. And I'll push it in with a press, and I'll show you how I assemble the vacuum cleaner later on. Okay, I've pushed the two bearings into more or less the right depth. That's what they look like. The segments is nice and clean. Now the armature goes into the machine, but you'll see the two carbon brushes there is obstructing it. Now there is a nut here. You can loosen this carbon brush holder and take it out, but there's wires here that start. So what I normally do is I just push the carbon brushes out away when I slide it in, and to do that I'll stick a screwdriver in to on the inside, if you want to just see there. Okay. And then we push the one, you can push the carbon brushes apart there. So you can do one carbon brush like that. So I put the weight on it, and then through these holes we push the carbon brushes apart. Okay, now we've got the armature back in its place, and then we have this plate that fits over the top, and we have these screws that holds it in position. So we just put the lock plate on, we push it in, and if the spacing is right, there should not be any pressure on the bearings. But if one of the bearings is not in deep enough, you can just tap it lightly on the armature and it will set in its right position. Now this lock plate that I'm tightening now, it's got little indentations there that line up, these little dots, that lines up with indentations on the casing itself, so you can't put it in wrong. And once you've got these markers in place, the armature should sit exactly in the middle. Now, being a sheet metal casing, you don't want to over tighten these screws because it doesn't take much to strip them. I don't do it with a torque wrench, but you can feel the tension on it, and just don't over tighten them. Okay, that's it. The armature turns freely. Now we can just assemble the whole rest of the machine. This plastic diffuser, and then there's a little spacer, and then your blade fits on. This diffuser has got two lining pins which has to line up with these two holes. There we go. Spacer and the blade, and here's the nut. To tighten this nut, I use the spanner like we did when we took it off. I just put a little bit of weight on it, and you tap it with a hammer, and that force actually tightens it, so we get it tight. And then you put this casing back on again. Now this is just a press fit. On the older vacuum cleaners, I took a hammer and tapped it in place, but with this, when you tap it, it all goes out of shape. So I just push it lightly in the vise like this, and you rotate this around, and you just push it all the way in like that. That's your motor. Now we can just run it. I'll just put a test cord on. We can run it for a minute and see what it sounded like. But with the old bearing, it wouldn't even turn properly because the bearing was worn out. Now when you run this, there's an awful lot of torque, so make sure you hold it quite tight. And we just there she goes. Sounds good. And that's how I change bearings on the Electrolux vacuum cleaner motor.